Hello everybody and welcome back to another Dundee local history video. And this week I'm going to do a more historical based story rather than a folklore one. And it's a story which connects to Dundee's shipbuilding and seafaring history. Now today the most famous Dundee built ship is definitely the Discovery. But this is a story of another boat built here who went down in history, sadly, for far less auspicious reasons. And this ship was named the Forfarshire. Now, when she was built in 1835, the Forfarshire was the largest steamship ever to have been built in Dundee, and crowds came out to see the launch of this ship. And she sailed on the Dundee to Hull line, which was an important and busy route in these days because it was much quicker for passengers going between the east of Scotland and down to England to use the sea rather than travel by road. And there was connecting ships going from Hull to London as well. So this was a really popular route, and the Forfarshire was the fastest boat sailing it. But sadly, she had hardly been on the sea for a year before problems started to set in. On the 5th of September 1836, the Forfarshire had just set off for Dundee, leaving Hull, when the crew noticed that the boilers were beginning to leak. And the captain, who was a man named John Humble, decided that they would probably last until they got up to Dundee and they would be best to press on with the voyage rather than returning to port. Now this was probably his first big mistake of the voyage, because by midnight on the second day at sea, the boilers were leaking water so fast into the engine room that the crew could not get in there, never mind keep the engine fires lit. So the ship's engines went down and she was left to drift. And the Forfarshire did have sails, but they weren't enough to carry the full weight of a 400-ton steamer and get anywhere at any speed. And as if that wasn't bad enough, it was night and a storm was beginning to get up, and it was getting harder and harder for the crew to keep the ship under control. By this point, they had made it more than halfway in their voyage, and they were passing the coast of Northumbria, just about at the Farne Islands. So Captain Humble decided that the best thing to do was to try and make it into the islands and find a port for the night. And it was dark and getting stormier, but he saw what he thought was the light of the lighthouse at Inner Farne, and he headed in towards the island. Now this was his second and his most fatal mistake, because Captain Humble had misread the charts, and instead of heading for Inner Farne, he was heading straight towards the Longstone Lighthouse. And the Longstone Lighthouse was one of those that warned ships of dangerous rocks lurking just below the surface of the water. And the Forfarshire drifted straight into one of them around 4 o'clock in the morning. It was not good. The ship started taking on water, and the crew immediately began running around trying to rouse any of the passengers who had somehow managed to sleep through this and get as many of them onto a lifeboat as possible. But it turned out they hardly had any time. Within 15 minutes, the Forfarshire had hit another rock, and this one broke her clean in two. Only 9 people had made it onto a lifeboat, and they were drifting out of sight on the tide. The back half of the ship was swept away and sank almost immediately, and this took most of the passengers and crew with it. But the front half was caught on the rock, swaying in the storm, and 9 more survivors had managed to clamber out of the wreckage and cling to the rock in the darkness. Now, on the lighthouse itself at Longstone, The lighthouse keeper's daughter, Grace, was awake and watching the storm. Grace had grown up around the sea, and she was now aged 22 and helped out a lot with the day-to-day running of the lighthouse. She was often seen waving to passing ships when the weather was good. But as soon as there got enough light in the morning for her to see that there were still people alive on the rocks, she knew she had to do something. And the storm had not gone down, and she realised it was going to be too dangerous for the lifeboat to make the journey from Sunderland to rescue them. So she made a decision, and she decided that her and her father would row out in their tiny rowing boat and see what they could do. And Grace and her father knew the sea around the rocks, so they managed to steer a path in between as the waves crashed over their heads, and they made it to the survivors who had been clinging to the rocks, almost giving up all hope. And because the boat was so small, it took 2 trips to get them all back safely onto the lighthouse. But by 9 in the morning, Grace and her father had rescued all of the survivors from the wreckage of the Forfarshire. And they would learn later that the 9 shipmates who had made it onto the lifeboat had also been lucky. A boat heading home to Montrose had picked them up after they'd floated on the waves for a few hours. But not long after the rescue was complete, the Darlings were surprised to see that another boat was coming in below the lighthouse. Because the Sunderland lifeboat crew, which included Grace's brother William, had not realised that the lighthouse keepers had set out to rescue the survivors, and they had thought that they would make their own journey in a smaller rowing boat. And they had arrived at the wreck and been dismayed to find that there was nobody left there, but decided that it was much safer for them to come into the lighthouse rather than try and make the full journey home. And they arrived and were astounded to find all of the rooms of the lighthouse full of survivors recovering from the shipwreck. And the poor lifeboat crew ended up having to shelter in a derelict building nearby for 2 nights until they were able to sail back. But the survivors of the Forfarshire all managed to go back to their daily lives, and most of them were from Dundee and round about. One of the people who lived to tell the tale was a man named David Grant, and he had been working on the ship as crew. And when he returned to Dundee, he lived in the hill town, and he gave up the sea and began working as a blacksmith in a Dundee factory. And he was employed there for many years. In fact, he was still working at the age of 77 when a journalist came round to interview him about his experiences in the 1880s. One of the saddest aspects of the story is that Grace Darling herself only lived for another 4 years or so after she rescued them, as she contracted tuberculosis and died at the age of 26. But after that rescue, Grace became a national hero. Both her and her father were awarded medals by the RNLI and the Humane Society. And of course, Dundee was particularly keen to celebrate her and her bravery. One of the things that commemorated her, of course, William McGonagall wrote a poem about the events. And Lord Panmure of Dundee also commissioned 3 paintings commemorating Grace and her father in portraits and the scene of the rescue, and you can now see these paintings in the McManus. And there's also a Grace Darling museum dedicated to her and her story in Northumberland as well, near where she lived. So that is the story of Grace Darling and the wreck of the Forfarshire. And we'll be back next week with another tale for you. Goodbye.